Hi again, and maybe it seems that we should make some progress on these slides because I spent the whole time last time on one slide. So let's get through this. Okay. So we talked about sensations a little bit already. So let's talk about perception. So the question is first, um, when we perceive something, what is it exactly that we are perceiving? Now, there are layers to that question. And that's an important question. Let me ask it again. When we perceive something, what is it exactly that we are perceiving? Now, that doesn't seem like a complicated question, right? Because, uh, I still have my coffee cup here. If we perceive the cup, we might think, well, I am perceiving the cup, obviously, right? And that means that my perception corresponds to something in the world, which happens to be a green stoneware coffee cup. But we also have to be worried about this question a little bit. And so before we do, I just have on this slide the kinds of things that we might typically perceive, right? Objects, we perceive what things are, but as I've also previously noted, we also perceive in a somewhat different way where things are. Size, distance, shape, spatial scale, and attributes are a little different from when I'm talking about agnosia, for example, are a little different from being able to say what it is and where it is, or different aspects of perception. In addition to objects, though, we can talk about events, right? So it's one thing to just look at an object and have a recognition that this object belongs to a class or a category of things, right? So I just recognize it in terms of its category membership. That's a cup, that's a chair, that's a dog, and so forth, right? But that's that kind of statement is thinking about objects more in an abstract sense. And I think what we want to do is to try to uh, talk about things in less of an abstract sense by getting at something like um, events, right? So I see a person, but I also see a person that's doing something, right? They're walking, they are waving at me, and so forth. Uh, I see, I have in the list here, I see something fall and break or bounce. I can see tree branches swaying in the wind. Um, if someone throws a ball to me, I don't just see that it's a ball, a baseball maybe. I see that it's coming towards me. I see that it's been thrown. I even maybe know something about exactly when it's going to get to me so that I can get my hand up to catch it just in time. And I can perform this very highly skilled interceptive action of catching, right? So there's all these complex events that can be perceived, and event perception may turn out to occur a little different than object perception, right? We can talk about objects having certain features that define what they are. And that might be a dog having certain physical characteristics or a chair having certain physical characteristics. But what are the essential features of an event? That's even perhaps a little more complex. And these are things that we're going to have to wrestle with a little bit. And of course, when it comes down to these things such as being able to physically interact with the world, to stand, to walk, to climb, to grasp. These are the physical interactions we have, and therefore it's maybe not just enough for us to be able to recognize a cup and a chair and a dog, or various types of events, or where things are in terms of distance and size, but also just in terms of the how, right? How do I manipulate this object? How do I interact with it? And there's a lot of variation there that maybe we need to deal with here. So now back to this question. What is it that we are aware of? Typically we say, yeah, it's just some object in the world, right? But let's have a look at a theory of perception, because this theory of perception is going to throw a wrench into what we might consider common sense. Common sense says that when I say I'm looking at a tree, that I am perceiving a tree, and that tree is a thing in the world that is out there for me to perceive and for you and anyone else to perceive who happens to come along and look at our tree. But we've already touched on this idea that what is really happening with vision is this idea that the senses are encoding information, in this case, photoreceptors in the eye are encoding information about light reflecting from that tree in the world. And that creates a code that is then sent to the brain. And the brain's job is to decode that signal to try to understand what kind of thing might be happening in the world that might have created this particular pattern of light intensity happening inside of the eye. And therefore, what the brain has essentially done is interpreted these sensory data. There's lots of different words for that. Interpret, decode, as I had mentioned, maybe infer or guess at what might be happening out there in the world. And therefore, our so-called perception of a tree is essentially the brain's best guess as to the likely state of affairs in the world that would have created a particular sensory pattern that our eyes have encountered at any point in time. And that is captured in this diagram. So it's a flow chart of sorts, if you will, right? We're going to go from left to right. We have out there in the world a tree. We're going to call it the distal stimulus, though. Why can't I call it a tree? Because that's not an object of perception. It's a thing in the world. And it is at a distance from us. We are not connected to it or in any contact with it necessarily. And so it is something that may stimulate our senses, though, so we can call it a stimulus. So then the arrow that goes from the tree to the eye is light. Light reflects from the tree and makes it into somebody's eye. And that also is a stimulus, right? It's a stimulus now that is much more up close to us, and it isn't coming into actual physical contact with our sensory surfaces. In this case, that light reflecting from the tree is activating photoreceptors inside of our eyes. And so this is our proximal stimulus. But again, the proximal stimulus is not a tree either, right? It is simply just light rays impacting the receptor surface and causing a stimulation of those receptors. As I have noted in the previous video about visual sensations, we can describe visual sensations in terms of brightness levels, which is presumably a function of the photon flux of light coming into the eye, and also color values, which would be a function of the wavelength of light coming into the eye. So the proximal stimulus can be described in terms of those physical characteristics, photon flux and wavelength, but the sensations are the psychological responses, the descriptive way to talk about them from a subjective standpoint. In terms of variations in brightness, some areas of the scene may appear to be bright, other areas of the scene may appear to be dark. Some areas of the scene may appear to be green. Some may appear to be brown or some other color. There's blue sky there too, but I didn't include that in our descriptions here. So these are the sensations. These are the elementary ways in which the photoreceptors can begin to encode information about the light coming from that tree into these basic elementary building blocks. But that's all that they are. So the mere fact that some part of the visual system can detect light of a specific wavelength and brightness that then becomes an idea of color and brightness doesn't say that it's a tree that caused that particular sensation, right? If I merely experience the visual sensation that something is green, I don't know if I'm looking at the leaf on a tree that caused that green sensation, or whether I'm looking at a blade of grass that caused that green sensation, or whether I'm looking at my green coffee cup that caused that green sensation, or whether I'm looking at a person wearing a green t-shirt that caused that sensation, and so forth. Lots of different things could cause a sensation, a visual sensation of the color green, right? So what is it that could be out there in the world that could cause this particular sensation? This is the job of the brain. And when it comes to talk about perception here. So this arrow, this final arrow going from the sensations of brown and green, bright and dark, I could put them in there too, to get us to the brain finally saying, okay, it seems like this must be a tree. It's a tree that I'm seeing here. And notice that the tree that I've drawn here is not, I didn't just copy and paste the photograph of the tree, but I have drawn a cartoon tree here, because what this tree is a mental representation, right? It is an idea in the mind. And so again, we might revisit our question, when we perceive something, what is it that we are perceiving? And the issue here is that common sense might tell us that it's a tree in the world, the thing over there on the left of the screen. But this theory says that the answer is actually that what I'm aware of at any point in time is an idea in my mind, that my brain has created and constructed a mental representation of reality on the basis of sensory data that's coming in here. And that's what I am aware of. My conscious awareness is really a mental representation of the world. It is not the world itself, right? I am not aware of reality. You are not. No one is aware of reality. Our awareness is mediated. So we might try to think that we could say something about reality. I could say, I think there's a tree out there. Surely there's a tree out there. But that knowledge is still indirect, right? What I'm directly aware of is the idea in my mind, the mental representation that my brain has constructed out of the sensations. So what we call the sensation-mediated perception, because of the idea that between my mind, which is the far right-hand side of this diagram, and the outside world, which is the far left-hand side of this diagram, there is a mediating factor here, and that would be the sensations themselves. The sensations, as I have defined them, are meaningless, right? Knowing that there's something brown, something green, something bright, something dark doesn't tell me whether it's a cup or a tree or a person in a green and brown t-shirt, right? Could be anything. And I have to figure out what's the better, most likely interpretation of that sensory pattern. And I'm going to construct a mental representation that will be that interpretation and inference of reality. So I create an inference of reality, and I hope that it is correct, but maybe there's room for doubt, right? And a comparison or analogy that I really like here that might make this somewhat clear is to think about what I call the translator problem. So to imagine, let's say that you're speaking to somebody who speaks another language than you do. So you only speak your language and they only speak yours. So they say something to you, and it is sounds that your ear can detect, and you hear those sounds, but to you, those sounds have no meaning. And so, of course, the idea is that we have to decode those sounds. If we spoke their language, our brains could decode this perhaps well enough, but we don't. So what do we need? We need a mediator, right? We need a translator who comes between, who speaks both languages. So that way, when that person says something in their language, our translator or mediator will convert it for us, right? And then they say something to us in our language that we hope being the key word here, will be a faithful translation. But of course, if you've ever heard the phrase lost in translation, we might always worry that there might be some aspects of physical reality that we simply cannot perceive because they cannot be translated into the mind. There is perhaps always something lost in translation. Maybe, though, it's also the case that our translator is lying to us. Now, that seems a strange thing to say, but nevertheless, that's been the subject of a lot of philosophy and for a long time here. If we go back to René Descartes, Descartes asked the question, how do we know that we're not just a brain in a vat? What if I was just a brain floating in a vat and some all-powerful evil demon or evil scientist or whatever figured out a way to kind of feed information in through all of our nerves to create activity inside of our brain that could convince the brain that those sensory patterns coming in through all these sensory nerves would be the same kinds of sensory patterns that would happen if our brain was actually in a body and our body was in a world looking at a tree. But in this case, though, there's clearly no tree. There's not even a body. We're just a brain in a vat experiencing a simulated reality. And all that our brain ever knows is the sensory data that comes in. And what really caused that sensory data could be a reality, but it could also be a simulation or a deception of some sort, right? So in this case, again, the idea that the senses deceive, that's a phrase you may have heard of as well. And so again, the idea is that there may be some sort of conversion error happening here, whether malicious, probably not, right? But nevertheless, the idea, of course, if you've ever seen The Matrix, exact same idea as the Cartesian brain in a vat. So what we're suggesting here is that this opens the possibility of doubt, right? That was a big theme in Cartesian philosophy, is that the relationship between our perceptual tree on the right-hand side versus the actual thing in the outside world is now doubtful, right? Is the tree that I perceive, does it correspond one-to-one exactly the same as the tree in the world? Is it really a tree out there in the world? And are the leaves really green? And is the trunk really brown? This becomes tricky because not only do we have the possibility of doubt about that relationship between perception and reality, this leads us to philosophical skepticism. In its extreme, it's called philosophical solipsism. Yeah, the possible of doubting the existence of any reality whatsoever. I don't think we like these ideas, right? But this perceptual theory kind of leaves open that little bit of room for doubt that we don't seem to like. At the heart of that doubt is the divided line in the middle of the screen here, where I'm referring to it as the mind-body problem, aka mind-body dualism. Everything on the left-hand side is described in physical terms, right? The object is a physical object out there in the world, the distal stimulus. The light striking the receptors can be described in physical terms, as I've mentioned, photon flux and wavelength. But everything on the right-hand side is a psychological descriptor. Sensations are bright and colorful, not wavelength and photons, right? And perception is my mental representation of a tree that has certain qualities of green and brown. It's not the same as the actual tree in the world. In fact, we could ask the question, even though I see the leaves as being green, are they really green? Does color exist in the world? Where did the green come from? Is the light coming from the leaf to the eye? Is it actually green, or is it really just light that's somewhere around 470, 500 nanometers in its wavelength? Is light around 500 nanometers actually green colored? We know that if I refract light out into the colors of the rainbow using a prism, I can see that green band, but are the rays themselves, the light rays themselves, do they have a color? Well, the conclusion of Isaac Newton, who was the first to do this, is no. The light rays themselves are not colored. So therefore, light does not have a color. It's simply just energy. It's photons that vary in their wavelength. Where did the color come from? It doesn't seem to exist until we cross that dividing line and we get to the right-hand side of the picture here. Color seems to be a psychological description that is possibly related somehow to physical properties of the world on the left-hand side, but it is not identical to the world, right? This would seem to suggest that the way in which we experience the world is influenced by reality, but remains somehow distinct from reality. That colors like green and red and blue are properties of experience. They are not properties of reality. And so there's a conversion that occurs where things become of a different kind. Light which varies continuously in its wavelength from 400 to 700 some nanometers is the visible spectrum, is carved up by vision into discrete colors of blue, green, yellow, orange, yellow, red, right? Yellow, orange, red. Got it wrong. Can't remember my Roy G. Biv, right? So what's going on there, right? The wavelengths just vary continuously up along a spectrum, but color varies discretely into categories. This is called categorical perception. So we get a large number of different light wavelengths. You know, the difference between 400 and 405 nanometers is simply just a 5 nanometer increase in the wavelength, the length actually between the peaks of the waveform of the light itself. It doesn't mean that it's a different color. And if we jump up from 465 to 470 nanometers, that's again a 5 nanometer difference. But that might put us close to a boundary between blue and green. I'm kind of guessing here off the top of my head. I'd have to look at a graph to remember exactly where that boundary lies. So forgive me if I'm wrong there. But you know, if that puts us closer to a boundary, then a 5 nanometer change in the wavelength actually then crosses a boundary. Even though the light is still just 5 nanometers longer in terms of its wavelength, it suddenly becomes a qualitatively different color. Why does that happen? And does that actually match reality? Would not seem to match reality, right? Because the light is just changing its length in terms of its waves, but it's becoming somehow fundamentally different in our experience. It goes from blue to green. It seemed to suggest that somehow the blue and the green are inventions of the mind. They're not part of reality in any objective way. And again, that's where dualism comes in, because these properties of the psychological things seem to be pretty disconnected from properties of physical things. But we still want to understand that relationship. That's what psychophysics, as I mentioned in the last video, is really all about. So out of all of this, one thing that we might think that we really are going to worry about is that last arrow, right? What actually goes on there to get from sensation to perception? That really is the crux of a lot of this kind of research, because as I have already noted, the job here, at least of the visual system, if we restrict ourselves to that topic for now, is to encode all of that data from the light distribution, all that reflected light is making it into the eye, and it's distributed across the inside of the eyeball called the retina. We'll talk about retinal anatomy later. And then the receptors receive that distribution of light intensity and wavelength and encode that. And then, so we want to understand how that works. We want to understand how eyes work. We want to understand the nature of visual sensations and how psychophysics works. But ultimately, how do we go from sensation to perception is the big question. It's the real psychological question. So we need to figure this out. That last arrow from sensation to perception is the crux of a real large bit of psychological theory. And so we're going to be tackling that as a major theme in this course. So as noted, perception is a mental representation, aka a constructed reality. That is, it is constructed out of the building blocks, which are the sensations themselves, right? So the sensations serve as the mediator in the same way that our translator who translates from one language to another, in that analogy I gave you, is translating. And then we're going to, so we have to build up now these sensations, an interpretation of reality, a construction. And then we become aware of this idea in the mind, right? We can see things, and then we can even call these images back to mind, right? The screen has already changed, but you can remember the photograph of the tree, perhaps. So you can call up that picture in your mind, and you can visualize the picture of the tree in your mind's eye. That is, unless you have aphantasia, which is a whole other thing that we're going to have to worry about as well, which is if we say that perceptual functioning has the job to build mental representations or mental images, what about people who don't actually experience mental representations? Because there are such people. right? That's called aphantasia. And if people don't really experience mental imagery, what does that say about this theory of perception that is entirely based in the concept of mental imagery? Well, whoops, perhaps. Well, one thing that you might detect in my tone so far is that this theory, as I have noted, has some philosophical concerns associated with it, right? We are going to be concerned whether or not this mentally constructed reality that we have going on inside of us corresponds to some actual reality. And to the extent that we start to suggest that it can't do such things, we cannot make such claims very well, then we start to get into questions of realism, right? Does human knowledge correspond to real reality, or does it correspond only to just shared ideas, right? So, for example, it might be the case. Let's go to the issue of dogs. And if you've taken my history and systems course, you've heard me talk about the question of what makes a dog, and how do we know dogs are even real? It might be the case that, well, or maybe the circle example is a little bit better, right? So, but let's go with dogs. So we have some trouble sometimes putting our finger on exactly what characteristic a dog has that makes it a dog. 4 legs and a tail and a fur coat don't seem to work because cats have that, and so do all kinds of animals, right? So it might be the case that if we fail, if we keep going on and on and on with this to the point that we kind of give up when it comes to identifying what the essential characteristics are, then what we might say, for example, is that the concept of dog is really just, it's not necessarily that we have perceived any sort of real physical characteristic that the animal has, but rather what we've done is we have noticed a particular pattern or correlation, importantly, of features. And we're going to just give a name to that correlation. And we're going to call that correlation dog. And there's a different pattern and correlation of features that we're going to call cat. And whenever we see anything that statistically fits one model versus another, we call it dog and we call it cat. But these names and groups and categories that we are using are essentially human invented fictions. They are what we call a social construct, right? That could apply to dogs and cats. It could apply to chairs. It could apply to colors, right? That red and green and blue are simply just social fictions that we use to describe and name the experiences that we are having. But there's no way to determine, this is another important part of the skeptical philosophy, whether my red is your red, right? You've probably heard of this before, this concern about when I look at something and I say, well, that looks red to me, and you look at it and say, yeah, that looks red to me. There's no guarantee that the actual phenomenological experience, to use that word again, that I have when I see something that I call red is the same as yours. All that we know is that we use the same label to describe the experience, but it might be that the actual nature of the experience itself is very different, but we would never know because language is the only thing that we have to go by. The labels that we use for our experiences are the only ways that we can communicate with each other. I cannot really transmit my experience directly into your mind. I just have to, we all have to use the same labels. And the fact that we agree on these labels means that we can socially construct a reality. But is that socially constructed reality objectively real? Maybe not, right? That's nominalism. Things exist only in terms of the names that we give them. Once we start going down this rabbit hole, this leads to skepticism or solipsism, as I've already noted. So therefore, maybe we don't want to do that, right? Maybe we're worried that we don't want to start to suggest that we cannot perceive reality. So we need a theory of perception that avoids this kind of skepticism. So how are we going to do that, right? Well, before we get there, let's ask this question. Are you sure that this kind of doubting is really all of that necessary? I mean, it's one thing to talk about the philosophy. Descartes raised this idea that we could just be a brain in a vat, but no one's seriously going to believe that we really are a brain in a vat living in a simulation. Never mind the popularity of the simulation hypothesis. that you may sometimes encounter these days. But let's look at some other things that have come up in recent years. So, oh, the dress, right? This was all the rage maybe around 10 years ago, or give or take, maybe a little more. So the question is, what color is the dress? And the problem here is that people see I think some people see white and gold, and some people see blue and black. I don't remember what the particular fight was. I always saw blue and gold, so never mind. But the idea here that people see this differently seems to suggest then again that, maybe what's happening here is that the particular visual code that our brains would normally successfully deal with is being really tricked somehow, and it's forced into doing something weird that it doesn't like, and therefore it leads to all kinds of different interpretations happening in different people. And maybe that's then an explanation for why the illusion of is happening, because or this difference of opinion at least is happening because, and of course, what I just said, difference of opinion, as if perhaps somehow perceiving reality is a matter of opinion. Yeah, that's the skepticism that we're actually trying to do away with. But hey, the dress seems to suggest then that maybe it is a matter of opinion or interpretation or judgment somehow. And our checkerboard thing down here on the bottom, right? So the idea here is that you ask a person, you look at the square labeled with the letter A and the square labeled with the letter B, and you can ask them, are those two squares the same brightness level, or is one darker than the other? Most people will say that square A is darker than square B. But literally, that's actually not true, because as you see, there's this green cylinder on the checkerboard that's casting a shadow over the middle of the board. And so square B, even though it's considered to be a white square on our black and white checkerboard, is in shadow. And if we were to measure the exact brightness value of the light coming from square B, we would determine that it is exactly the same brightness as the light coming from square A. They have the exact same brightness level, square A and square B. But we do not see them that way. We see square A as a dark square and square B as a light square, even when their brightness is exactly identical. So it seems to suggest here that, again, the eye is somehow not doing what we think it does, right? So I have this description here of the eye somehow functioning like a camera. Maybe comparing it to a digital camera is a reasonable analogy, because a digital camera has inside of it a bunch of light-sensitive diodes, individual pixel values, right? Every light-sensitive diode inside of the camera measures light intensity and light wavelength at that pixel location in the image. And the more pixels you have in your image, that comes from having more of these light-sensitive diodes inside of your camera. And that gives you better resolution because it gives you smaller pixels and it lets you capture finer detail, right? And so if you've ever heard of something called a retinal display, which was an Apple idea from many years ago, the idea is that that display would have the same number of pixels as your eye does in terms of how many receptors are in your eye, in terms of this, the receptor density there, the pixel density and the receptor density would match each other. So that way you would have really nice looking, clean, crisp, clear looking images on the screen. It would not appear pixelated the way that certain low resolution computer screens might look to you, especially if you go play some video games from the 1980s. You would see some really heavily pixelated screens, right? So, but the idea here is that the eye has all of these receptors that are measuring light at specific locations all throughout the interior of the lining of the eye, called the retina. And these photoreceptors on the retina are measuring light intensity according to these two dimensions, right? The intensity in terms of the total number of photons, called photon flux, as well as the wavelength, because light is a wave as well as a particle, right? And so the idea is that now the distance between the peaks in the wave determine the wavelength of the light, and these somehow become our psychological descriptors of brightness and color. But what we're seeing with our checkerboard illusion is that this is not even working correctly, right? Because the intensity of the cellular responses for the receptors that are looking at square A should be identical to the receptor responses for the that are looking at square B. And even though the receptors should respond in the exact same way at square A and square B, and maybe they do, at the level of perception, something is different, right? So the receptor response at square A and square B is identical, but at the perceptual level of responding, square A and square B are not identical. Square A is dark and square B is light. Maybe we could say the same thing about the dress, right? That presumably, regardless of who is looking at the image of the dress, it's activating the same wavelengths, the same light wavelengths are coming off of the screen. The same light wavelengths are activating the receptors in your eye. So the receptor response is always identical, but the perceptual judgment is not. Some people see it one way, some other people see it a different way. What's going on between sensation and perception that leads to that difference? Despite the identical nature of the sensory receptor response, perceptual judgments remain distinct from that, and there's room for difference and variation in perception, despite the lack of variation at the level of sensation. Well, this is one reason why we think that, yeah, maybe there is a difference between sensation and perception, and that perception is in the job somehow of trying to make some sense out of the world and interpret the world. Occasionally things go wrong, right? What are some other ways in which we might start to doubt our senses, especially with vision? Well, we need to think about how the eye works a little bit. There's more detail in later chapters, but the idea here is that the eye, the chambered eye that we have, all vertebrates have a chambered eye. It works in this projection kind of scheme here. So we're looking at a pencil pointed up, right? The light has to be first captured by the cornea, the outer layer of the eye, which helps funnel the light through the pupil. The lens behind the pupil is an adjustable lens that helps us now focus the light rays to the interior lining called the retina, especially the central retina called the fovea, which is our fine detail vision. One of the things that you'll notice is that the retinal image of that pencil is inverted. Right now, the inverted pencil is pointing down. And on top of that, it's obviously curved because the inside of the lining is hemispherical of the eye here. It's not a flat projection surface. It's the interior of the eyeball. It is rounded, right? So we have this inversion and some linear distortion of the projected pencil, and therefore the image projected to the inside of the eye, and that's going to stimulate the receptors, has this kind of distortion. So there's something that the brain's going to have to correct for. We don't see the world as upside down, right? So the brain's going to have to fix that. There's also a dimensionality reduction happening here, right? So what happens is that we perceive a three-dimensional world. Presumably the world is three-dimensional, but projected images like this are flat, right? So once more, with the coffee cup, it's a three-dimensional cup, right? It has a height, it has a width, but it also has a depth, right? But in this image that you're seeing right now, you cannot see the depth axis of the coffee cup, right? It is a three-dimensional object that's projected into the two-dimensional photograph. And therefore, you can only see its height and its width, but not its depth. So the depth dimension is lost in retinal images here. So how do we see a three-dimensional reality, given the fact that the visual input is inherently flat and two-dimensional? Well, again, the idea is that maybe the job of the brain is to reconstruct the third dimension somehow. But again, the key word being construct, right? The third dimension is somehow a constructed dimension, a representation of the third dimension, rather than being the third dimension in and of itself. What else we have here? Chromatic aberration. So when the lens refracts the light rays coming from our pencil here, the magnitude of that refraction, that is the degree to which the light ray is bent so that it can be focused properly on the retina, is a function of the wavelength of the light. So the medium of a lens interacts a little bit with different wavelengths in different ways. And so blue wavelengths, the shorter wavelengths, are bent a little bit more than the longer wavelengths, which includes the red end of the spectrum. And so this is called chromatic aberration because of the idea that if we bend the shorter blue into the spectrum a little more than we do the red into the spectrum, then that means that those light rays are not being brought together at the same point. And this creates what's chromatic aberration, is a fancy way of saying color blur, right? That's what we're seeing in this image on the bottom here, is that we have a photograph of some spires of some castle, and the top version has chromatic aberration, where you see this kind of blue ghosting to the side, to the left there a little bit, right? That's because the camera itself has a lens that really had a lot of chromatic aberration and did not bring the blue part of the spectrum into alignment with the other colors, so that now you're kind of seeing a double image. There's a blue ghostly castle kind of floating to the left of the rest of the castle, right? But of course, on the bottom, we see what happens if we do an appropriate correction to the image to eliminate that color shift or chromatic aberration, and we fix it, and everything is now aligned properly. So now we might suggest that it's another thing, because we don't really perceive a reality where objects have blue ghostly outlines, right? And the reason for that is that our brain perhaps is actually fixing that chromatic aberration in the same way that image processing apps like Photoshop can do that with this image itself. And then what about the pointillistic? What does that mean? You ever heard of pointillistic art? That's what this is. This is a painting by George Seurat, if I say that correctly. And I'm blanking on the name of the painting, but nevertheless, it should be easy enough for us to identify what we're seeing here, right? We're looking at people spending a casual afternoon on a sunny day by a body of water, and some people are in boats, but most people are just hanging out on the grassy lawn under some trees. Apparently there's a dog and a monkey. It's a couple of dogs, I guess. Now, we see people, we see trees, we see a couple of dogs, so on and so forth. But are there actual trees and people? Well, I mean, it's a painting, obviously not real, but when I see the tree branches, for example, or the tree trunks, I think to myself, well, I see their edges and I see their lines, and that's how objects are defined, after all, is by their shapes and their edges and contours. But the problem here, and this is the unique characteristic of Seurat's artwork, is that it's pointillism. There are no lines in this image at all. Everything is made by making tiny dots. And so by taking tiny dot after dot after dot, and you can get a sense of that if you look at the boundaries and borders of the image, lots of little red and blue dots. But the entire painting is dots. It's just that the way he creates these dots is done in such a way that it creates, I guess we could say, the illusion of continuous lines, but there are no continuous lines. There are no continuous brush strokes here, right? So therefore, there's no line, there's no brush stroke. There's only dots, but we're not really seeing that. We're organizing those dots together to create the perceptual whole of trees and trunks and people and so on and so forth. So the human eye works like this a little bit as well, because we have these millions of photoreceptors lining the retina of the eye. Those are individual cells, sort of like the individual pixels in a digital camera. And technically, there's tiny little spaces or gaps between the cells because they are just neurons packed in really close to each other, right? And therefore, they're just sampling little bits and pieces of the light rays that are coming in. There would technically, it's equivalent to this pointillistic array of dots on the canvas, right? And so just like with the art, vision is a pointillistic array of photoreceptor responses that we don't really see as pointillistic. We see continuity rather than dots, right? So the question is, how do we get to reality, right? So this idea is called indirect realism. Indirect realism is the idea that even though we might have to know reality through this mediator of sensations, our translator issue that I've talked about before, we don't want to be a solipsist or a skeptic of human knowledge. We want to say that yes, human knowledge does correspond to reality. So we are going to hopefully espouse the point of view called realism, right? But our knowledge of reality is still necessarily indirect, right? We have that intermediary of the sensations. And all of these various intermediate steps between the tree in the world and the tree in my mind are somehow imperfect, right? Light reflecting to the eye is not perfect. The eye encodes the data, and that's not perfect. And the data has to be interpreted by the brain, and that's not always perfect. But despite the imperfect nature of all of these many stages and steps along the way, we still want to hope that my mental representation of the tree tells me something true about reality so that we can be a realist and not a skeptic or solipsist, right? So here we see that despite these challenges, we're going to hope that our perceptual inference is, in fact, true and valid. Or the appropriate word here is called veridical, right? We want perception to be veridical. And that means that perception is telling us the truth about the real world. Of course, one question is whether or not perception is true or veridical. Is how would we know if it was or was not? Because we don't necessarily have an alternative way to check it, right? Think about our translator problem again, right? If I were to go back to this question where the person says something to me in a foreign language and then the translator translates it to me, I could maybe double check my translator, but how would I do that? I could get another translator and say, hey, is that person right? But if my translator is lying or not very good, then how do I know that my second translator is also not lying or any good at this task? So hard to rely on that method. But what might happen is that if the translator tells me something and it's not exactly the right appropriate translation, then when I say something back and I try to form a conversation and have some kind of an interaction with our other party who speaks this other language, eventually things might break down because the faultiness of the translator is now causing us to fail in our ability to interact and communicate with that other person. So I could check the translator simply through practicality, right? If my translator is working, I'm going to be able to survive in the world, right? Let's move away from our translator problem to our perception of reality. If I am somehow failing to perceive reality in some truthful, veridical way, how am I going to survive as a living animal in the world, right? Presumably this is why we have perception, is we need to be able to interact with the world around us to get food and shelter and all the things that we need. And if perception is working to allow me to walk around in a cluttered environment to get what I need and to avoid threats and danger, then to some extent it must be telling me some kind of truth of reality. So it has a pragmatic reality, right? And so this is how we might not be able to know if perception is real or not, because simply it works. So let's keep going on this regard a little bit here. So we might say that perception largely works. Sometimes it fails. The dress checkerboard illusion provides some example. In fact, the whole study of illusions is part of this whole thing about trying to understand what's going on between sensation and perception. And maybe we can have some success here in trying to understand how we go from sensation to perception if we can understand the kind of images that cause that process to break down. The dress is an example of that. So if we understand, well, what's causing that to happen, then that might help us learn some things about exactly what goes on in the conversion from sensation to perception. And so what we need to do, the dress is really a complex example, but maybe what we can do is we can have some simplistic diagrams and images and so forth that will consistently, quote unquote, break the perceptual system. And if we understand that, maybe that's going to help us understand how the whole thing works, right? So what is an illusion? Sometimes the idea is that things can look different despite having the same retinal image. That's what I wrote there, right? But that's what's going on with the checkerboard pattern, right? Square A and square B have the same retinal image, the same brightness values, the same receptor response, but at a perceptual level, they look different from each other, right? There's some other examples of this. Classic one here is the Mueller-Lyer illusion. So what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to show this image to somebody and ask them whether or not the blue line and the red line, are they the same length or is one longer than the other? You've probably seen this before, and you probably know that the answer is that they're the same length, but people who have never been exposed to this before will say that the blue line is longer. Why? Well, it's something to do with the orientation of those arrows on the ends of the lines, right? Why does it work? Well, if we understood that, maybe we might be able to understand some things about how perception works. Here's one possible explanation. It may or may not be the right explanation, but it's at least a very common and popular explanation. The blue line looks like the inside of a building, especially if we imagine reorienting this vertically. It kind of looks like the inside of a corner of a room, right? Where if it was oriented vertically, the blue line would be at the corner, and the arrowheads would be where the corner meets the floor and the ceiling. So it looks like something that's receding away in the distance. But if you were standing on the outside of a square building, the red line would be more appropriate, right? The red line would be vertical and it would be the outside corner, and then where it meets the ground and the sky would be the other arrowheads there. So this seems to somehow activate our experience looking at square buildings, either on the inside or the outside of such buildings and rooms, right? And so researchers propose that if this is the case, then if we were to go to remote parts of the world where, because these kinds of right angles exist in our constructed reality, right? But there are places in the world where they don't build such buildings. Right angles don't typically occur in nature, and if we don't build rectangular buildings with right angles, then a typical person might never encounter these kinds of stimuli. And so if we take this Mueller-Lyer illusion to some remote part of the world where people don't build square buildings, and they have very limited and restricted experience with looking at objects with right angles, then maybe they would not fall prone to the illusion. And that's what the research had suggested, is that these people who have limited experience living in such constructed realities where buildings are made in square and rectangular shapes, they tend not to see the illusion. They will correctly say that the two lines are the same length, instead of saying that the blue line is longer. So there's something about our experience living in a constructed environment that makes us be tricked by this illusion. So past experience, perhaps, is influencing our perceptual reality. And this could also explain other things. Oh, so I just sneezed there, excuse me. Another example here is the horizontal vertical illusion, where again, the green line and the red line really are the same length. But if you ask people, they will tend to say that the vertical green line is longer. There's also an L-shaped version of this because the bisection of the red line sometimes is one explanation, but you can replicate this just by making them in an L shape as well. One thing to think about here, if you want to do an experiment, is what relationship between the red and the vertical and the horizontal line do we need to have here, right? Do they need to be touching each other at all in order to create the solution? How far apart do they need to be before the illusion starts to dissipate, if ever, right? What are the geometric properties of this image that strengthen the illusion versus weaken the illusion, and why? Here's the Ponzo illusion. This one also might, that's very red on my screen here. This one also might be an example of living in a certain kind of constructed environment. We see that people say that the top horizontal black line is longer than the bottom horizontal black line. They really do have the same length. But of course, this looks like a kind of like a roadway or a sidewalk or something. And so the one at the top would be something large that lies across the whole roadway and extends off the sides. And that's why maybe it looks longer. So again, it's past experience with certain kinds of depth stimuli, like a sidewalk or a roadway, again, places where there's straight lines. Oh, that's a contrast. So the herring illusion at the top, the two red horizontal lines are in fact straight and parallel. They appear to kind of bow out in the middle, but they do not in reality. They maintain the same distance all the way across. Again, there may be some aspect of those radial lines that causes this to occur. The Poggendorf illusion, the red line on either side of our rectangle here are in fact perfectly aligned with each other, but people will tend to report that they are shifted vertically a little bit, that they're kind of offset. Again, why? But the idea is that, again, despite the objective reality of the image, perception seems to mess it up somehow, right? So again, we come back to our conclusion that our steps from reality through eyes, through sensations is unreliable and imperfect. And we have to have some sort of internal cognitive process to fix it up. But we have to worry about whether or not the system that does this works. And we think most of the time it does. We are capable of generating illusions that break the system. And maybe by breaking the system, these illusions can teach us a little bit about why the system makes the choices that it makes. And that doesn't necessarily mean that all perception is always illusory, just means that we can somehow occasionally break it just so in a way that might teach us something about how the system works in the first place, right? But again, the idea is that we're building these mental representations of the world. Now, I think what we want to do at this point, I kind of hinted at this idea that past experience is relevant to the kinds of interpretations that the perceptual process makes, and that differences in past experience may in fact play an important role in whether we fall victim to some of these illusions. Maybe it determines your reaction to the dress picture. Who knows, right? But in order to get into some of the details of a modern theory that's more of a psychological theory and no more philosophy, I think we want to cut it here and start a new video where we get into the details of the perceptual theory of Hermann von Helmholtz and try to connect Helmholtzian ideas to modern perceptual psychology, which we will do to finish up, I think, in one last chunk here. We can finish the rest of this, but we're going to stop this one right now.